Okay, this mini presentation is intended to show you a flow chart and a process for discussing performance as it relates to implementation of a strategic plan. As we mentioned in class, the plan can exist on paper, but unless it actually gets implemented and the people are engaged and involved in the process, it just remains a plan that can sit around and collect dust and not actually make any difference in the strategy of the organization. Oftentimes there will be performance issues as you go through this. And this is not a class in human resources or management or a deep dive into performance reviews. But when we're talking about implementation of a strategy, it is important to understand what issues are at play and what are some of the obstacles that may get in the way when we talk about individual performance. So this is a flow chart that is relatively self-explanatory, but I am going to talk through it step by step and emphasize a few key points as we go through. And this can also be used for your own performance reviews, or if you're in a management position and you're supervising others, how you go about discussing performance with other people in your group. And it really starts off with identifying whether there is a performance gap or a success in performance. If there are expectations that are set, or you're feeling like somebody is not meeting their expectations, or maybe they're doing great with their expectations, if there's a success, then you reinforce that success. But if you identify that there's a gap in what they're doing and how they're doing it, then you've got to ask yourself the question, is it worth your time and effort? Oftentimes, when we think about some performance issues, it might be a one-time shot. It might be a one-time short-term thing, and generally this person is a solid performer, and you need to say, okay, well, maybe it's just a one-time thing. It's not really worth my time. I'll give this person another chance. And if it is, then don't waste your time on it. If it is worth your time, then you get down to this question of, yes, it is worth your time. Then you've got to ask yourself the question, does the person know your expectations? Do they even know what they're expected to do? Who's supposed to do it, what they're supposed to do, where, when, and how? And do you know what their focus and aspirations are? Because they may be clear on their expectations, but it may be different from what their other priorities are at play here. So if they don't even know what their expectations are, then you get to the box here of no. Then you need to get into some discussions about provide some work planning or clarifying and documenting these expectations for that person. If you determine that the person does know their expectations, and your answer to this question is yes, then you got to ask yourself the question, does the person and do you know how each of you are doing relative to each other's expectations? You may be talking about different types of expectations, and they may believe that they're meeting their expectations and you see that they're not. So there's a mismatch in what's going on here. So if the answer is no, that you don't know how they're doing relative to expectations, then you got to check for understanding and find some ways to provide them feedback. Now again, this isn't a class in human resources or personnel management, so I'm not going to get into the details of how you go about checking for understanding and providing feedback, but it is important to make sure that people are on the same page in terms of the expectations that are set. If you determine that the expectations are clear and they do understand how they're doing relative to the expectations, then the question becomes, are there obstacles beyond that person's control? If the answer is yes, then part of your role can be to help them to remove the obstacles or help them seek help in doing so. It's not necessarily worth a performance discussion with somebody if there are obstacles in the way that have nothing to do with their motivation or their skills or their ability to do it. It might just be something that is beyond their sphere of control and sphere of influence. But if you realize that there are no obstacles that are beyond that person's control, then you ask the question, does the person even have the skills, ability, knowledge, and desire to perform as they should be, as you would like them to be? If they don't, then if they don't have the skills and abilities, then you got to say, okay, well, maybe we'll provide them some training to develop those skills, or give them some practice, some opportunities to develop them further, or provide some coaching. But if they don't even have the skills, even though they're clear on the expectations, it's unlikely and unreasonable to expect that they're going to be able to meet those expectations. So then let's say, okay, well, we decide, yes, they do have the skills and abilities and the knowledge. Then the question becomes, do undesirable consequences follow desired performance? Do undesired consequences follow desired performance? And sometimes this trips people up a little bit here because it's kind of a double negative here. Let me give a particular example here. If the desired performance is that somebody is going to engage more with clients outside of the office, or be on the road more and get out and doing sales, or do a deep dive into some of the intense details of a quality control program of some sort. That's the desired performance. But if the undesired consequences of that mean that they're going to be on the road a lot more, or needing to interface with external clients, or in the example of a deep dive into the quality things, maybe that becomes this incredibly detail-oriented, task-based quality assurance approach that is not of interest to them, and they don't have the skills. Then there's undesirable consequences for them doing the work that is needed. If that's the case, and the answer is yes, then you got to think about, okay, do we change the consequences, or do we transfer the person and find somebody else who can do this? There may be very legitimate reasons why a person can't or doesn't want to, for example, be on the road and traveling a lot at a particular time in their career. If that's the case, it needs to be a conversation with them to understand and find the right person who can do it. Or you change the consequences and find a way that they can maybe do this role and meet the expectations without traveling so much. If the answer to that question is no, then we get down to question number 8, which is, do desirable consequences follow undesired performance? And again, this one tends to trip some people up too, because it's like, well, how can you get desirable consequences from undesirable performance? And an example of that is if somebody has a chronic tendency to show up to meetings late, or maybe just not show up at all, or to leave early, or they always have a double conflict and they're always distracted during meetings. And as a result of that, they're not assigned tasks or jobs or given additional roles and responsibilities to do. And that might be actually what the desired consequence is for this person. They show up late, they leave early, they're distracted, and they are not getting any extra work. That might be exactly what they want. That's a desirable consequence. But it's certainly not a desired performance for them. So if the answer to that question is yes, then you say, okay, well, we need to change the consequences. And one simple thing for that particular example is, even if you're not here, we're going to assign you jobs and tasks and responsibilities to do. And then it becomes a bigger discussion about accountability. If the answer to that question is no, then finally you get to the question of, could the person perform the task as desired if they wanted to? So this is where we get to questions of motivation. Nothing to do with skill, nothing to do with expectations or communications. All that stuff has been taken care of. Now you get to the point of motivation. Could they do it if they wanted to? If the answer is no, and you've gone through all these other questions, expectations are clear, communications clear, consequences are fine, they have the skills to do it, and they just don't want to, then it becomes the very difficult discussion and decision about, do you transfer that person or do you terminate their employment? If the person could perform as desired if they wanted to, and the answer to that is yes, then you get to the approach of redirecting the behavior via coaching or frank feedback session, or just trying to understand what it is behind them that is not motivating them to do it. And not everything can be motivating in the work that we do. Sometimes you just got to step up and do the job that's at hand. But the reason I go through this step by step here is because oftentimes we truncate the process when there's undesirable performance or somebody's not meeting expectations. Oftentimes what we do is we jump right to the end and we blame the person and we say, why aren't you doing what you should be doing? And it may have nothing to do with them. It may have to do with situations beyond their control. It may have to do with that they thought they were doing fine, but nobody's ever told them otherwise. They never received any feedback. And it may be just that expectations aren't clear. And as soon as they are, then they might be able to step up to do the job. Regardless of where you end up going, the end point for all of this is to get back up here to the top, to where you're observing, monitoring, and measuring the performance there, and then you kind of go through the cycle again. But again, if we're not effective in the way that we go about discussing and managing and making sure that people are on board with their performance, then the best laid plans of a strategy aren't going to go very far, because we're not going to have the individuals doing the work as we need to. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and with the rest of the work for the week as we talk about implementation of strategic planning. This is just individual performance level discussion.